And so instead of our Torah reading, some opportunity to reflect on Torah, what would be read, and the teaching of Torah is distinctive in that when we read Torah, there's two parts. We read Torah for what it says, and then we seek to apply it to our own lives. And so this morning, our Torah reading is Parshat Bamidbar, in the desert, the beginning of the book of Numbers, the fourth of the 5 books of Moses. Bamidbar, this fourth of the 5 books, has 10 parshiot, 10 weeks that are divided for its reading, which include 36 chapters. It's a description of the Israelites at Mount Sinai, the second year, the first month after the liberation from Egypt, and their journey toward the promised land. And so for all of the book of Numbers, we have a people with their eyes looking forward to the land, Eretz Zavat, Chalav Udvash, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. It's an arduous journey. The people Bamidbar are in the desert and uncertain as they live their lives day to day where they're going and when they'll get there. It's a collection of stories of daily life that sadly, from hindsight, as we read these stories, are about rebellion. In some cases, people like Korach, Moses' cousin, vying for power by asserting, "Who are you, Moses, to be over us? We are all holy people." People complaining over the lack of what they remember they had in Egypt, those cucumbers and fish and onions. And the sense that going into the promised land is going to be beyond our ability. As the 10 of the 12 spies return in the book of Numbers with the report, yes, it is indeed an extraordinary land, but the people there are like giants, and we were like grasshoppers in their eyes. And as the rabbis will point out, the spies could not have known how they were seen in the eyes of the locals. That was projection. The Israelites, these former slaves, had a lack of confidence. They saw themselves as if they were too feeble to vanquish and to take the promise. And so it is particularly that moment in the book of Numbers where the people say, "Let's go back to Egypt," that God says, "Enough with this rebellious people. Moses, let me start over with you. I'm going to wipe them out. You will be the one who will be my people." And Moses says, "Then wipe me out from your book. Don't do it, God. It would not be in your interest, nor would it fulfill your promise." And God remarkably recants, and the journey continues. A journey that during the day is guided by a cloud, God's presence, and at night by a fire, and always with, if you will, Mount Sinai at their center. In the book of Exodus, it is the giving of law at Mount Sinai that is the pinnacle. In the book of Leviticus, it's how those laws will be applied by the priests and how the people, as a people, can aspire to be a holy people. that anticipates their role, their life, their commitment when they get to the promised land. And now with the journey, they have constructed this tabernacle with a blue roof. When they encamp, it's at the center. And when they march, according to another place in Torah, the ark, the Aron Kodesh, leads them. And so we are, as we begin the book of Numbers, doing an accounting of who is this people. There is the number cited of 603,550 when you add up all the 12 tribes. That's an accounting just of the men who are 20 years or older, which means that in this 40 years of march, there are over 2 million people. Not for today, but for another time. How do we read Torah? Do we read it literally as history or as a memory that gets embellished and is told, as is the nature of memory, to make important points that transcend, if you will, the facts themselves? 603,550, Levi Yitzchak of Bardichev, that great lover of Israel, that Hasidic master of Ukraine of the 19th century, will say, corresponds to the ancient teaching that there are 603,550 letters of Torah. And he said that to emphasize that every life is precious. For if even one letter in the Torah scroll is erased, the Torah is no longer fit for the recitation of blessings, which is to say, every human life is precious. That's homiletic. And one must make a distinction between what is the nature of the story, its pshat, its literal reading, and its drash, its interpretation. Our Eitz Chaim Chumash, which I am so fond of, edited by my beloved teacher David Lieber, is as if wearing bifocals in the commentary, where above the line it's pshat, it's the literal understanding, and below it's drash, interpretation. And this way of viewing the text with bifocals of pshat and drash, of the literal and the interpretive, is how we need and do see the world around us. Sometimes it's hard to read the pshat. In looking at the world around us, it's hard to know what's real, what's the story. For every story is always told from a point of view. In that sense, it's a drash. It's not neat and clean. What is pshat? What is the actual words, the story, and what is drash? Because there's always a gap. And I'm reminded of a story to explain how we only bring our own experiences sometimes to what we see. There is that story of the butcher who moves to a new town, and he finds that his next door neighbor is a milkman. And the butcher, wanting to put on his best foot forward, invites over the dairyman from next door, and he says to his wife, "You know, we have a special guest, our neighbors. We shouldn't eat the same things we eat every night. Every night it's steak, it's meat. We have over somebody special. For us, what would be unusual is to do a beautiful dairy meal." And so they prepare this beautiful meal, and the dairyman comes over, and they go home, and the dairyman says to his wife, "I'm a little disappointed. I was looking forward to, a good piece of flunk and a nice piece of meat. But they served what we eat every night." Which is to say, even with best intentions, It's only natural that we see the world from our own experience, even when we intend to be gracious and good. Sometimes we fail to engage in the act of taking the time, and it's not easy to see the world from somebody else's point of view, all the more in a situation of conflict. It's very hard to let go of one's own pain, to understand the pain of another. As a rabbi, I'm involved at times in counseling of couples in the midst or in the aftermath of divorce. Sometimes it's in the context of trying to put together a bar or a bat mitzvah. And I'm aware in that situation how sometimes a couple who've gone through a bitter divorce are unable to be in the same room with each other because it's so painful how they have experienced the other. And when I do counseling, what I try to do, though, again, it depends on the person, not necessarily even with the couple, but when one of them comes to me, the bar mitzvah is coming up, and they're now fighting over who's going to get which aliyot. I will say to that party in front of me, just as an opportunity to broaden and understand this challenge, what would your spouse say in response to what you've just shared with me about how unreasonable they are? Engage for a moment in an act of empathy. And some can and some can't, but when that person is able in that safe space of my office, one-on-one, to provide me with the empathic response of the other, there's often a letting go, a breathing out of feeling victimized, and saying, well, I guess it is complicated. They do have some needs as well. And that image of the pain of a divorce, which is not always the case, but is all too often the case, is all the more true for the political situation in Israel. And that's the application of our march toward the promised land. For we as a Jewish people read our Torah every cycle as the mindset of we are leaving Egypt, counting the days to Mount Sinai, and then from Mount Sinai and Midbar, looking forward to entering into the land, which Moses never does. You see, the Torah reaches unrequited love, where Moses looks down from Moab, from the mountains, looking over toward the Jordan and never enters. And then we begin again our cycle of reading. That longing to enter into the land for 2,000 years was our people's longing after we were exiled by the Romans. Every time we ate a meal in our grace after meals, 3 times a day, if we ate bread, we said, praised are you, God, who rebuilds Jerusalem. Every time we said the Amidah on a weekday, we faced, even on Shabbat, toward Jerusalem. We prayed, may you rebuild Jerusalem. It's because we believed that God had promised that land, the land of our ancestors, the land in which the prophets preached that we needed to be a holy people, that we would return. And the miracle was, for what is for many recent history, we return to that promised land. I've lived in Israel for 5 years, on and off, always in the context of being, well, not always, 4 of the 5 as a university student. I was there in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and as a 19-year-old, my first exposure to war. I have a family member who was killed in a tank toward the beginning of that Yom Kippur War, and his body would not be identified till months later. And I know the pain, the anguish. I know of a first cousin who in that same war as a paratrooper on the front lines was bit by a viper as he reached his hand out from a foxhole. He lost that finger, and he was in a hospital that I visited during the war due to the poison of the bite. And so war, I know, not well, but I know it more than people who live only in America. I know the price that gets paid by Israelis who send their children, unlike Linda and myself, who sent our children to universities. I know my cousins who send their children into the army and into danger at that same pivotal formative age. I know the hate that exists on both sides, both meaning Jewish and Arab, Israeli and Palestinian, that comes with claiming the same land and having endured the battles in which their family, if not themselves, have been injured. I know how hard it is to step away from that quality of distrust and pain. And so what I'd like to share is just a few things that I feel might be helpful to some in understanding the challenges of peace. The first thing I feel a need to share is that the majority of Israelis are people of color. I say that because in America, all too often, because it's simple, Israel is presented as the white, powerful, colonial power taking advantage of a weaker, darker-skinned people, as if it's Black Lives Matter translated to the Middle East. That analogy doesn't really fit. It's much more complicated. The majority of Israelis today are Sephardim. They are people whose skin color is no different than the Arabs among whom they live. In many cases, darker. The Jews who come from Yemen, for instance, or from Ethiopia for sure, are usually darker skinned than the local population. It's not about race. So that's the first thing to share. It's not about race. It's not only about religion, though there is an element of that, in that for Arab Israelis, of whom there are about 2 million, 10%, about 200,000, are Christian. Many are descendants from the time of the Crusaders. I will add that there's a lot of tension in the Arab community between Christians and Muslims. So, for instance, in the sacred Christian city of Bethlehem, which was historically majority Christian, it is not currently so because Christians have left due to discrimination and even violence by Muslims against Christians among the Arabs. It's not simple. What is true is that Arabs are primarily identified with Arabic, their native language that unites them across those religious lines, as Jews are more or less identified, regardless of where they come from, by Hebrew. And there is strong nationalism on both sides. So the first myth, in terms of not to be like that butcher inviting the dairyman over, is that there are differences between America and Israel. We can't overlay our own experiences to life there. And maybe the second, which relates, is there is distrust and hatred on the ground that's not like what we experience fully in America. I say that in a moment in which, in the Black Lives Matter movement, we've become more aware of a natural inclination in a larger society to look at blacks as lower, and that is a reality. There is a caste system. At the same time, and where it's complicated, that's social, that's sociological, that trickles into politics and law as it's implemented. But what is also true is that in America, all are equal under the law in theory, and opportunity is there, though not fully equal. That's reality sociologically, not necessarily legally. And in Israel, there too, in theory, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, those 2 million, are equal. And some of them have gone on to do amazing things, serve currently on the Israeli Supreme Court. In fact, just a week ago, before this violence began, it was a coalition of Arab parties that was the kingmaker to be in the coalition for the first time. Because in the Israeli elections, Israeli Arabs have a right to vote. They have political power. And we're going to be the decisive. Even Prime Minister Netanyahu negotiated with Abbas of the political parties and wanted him to come into his coalition of the right wing as well. So that's to say, it is to be acknowledged that it's not so simple. Arabs in Israel also have political power. And yet, sociologically and understandably and not, Palestinians are not always treated equally. Because there is distrust, because there is pain, because there's a sense of lack of loyalty. There's reason for it. At the same time, I am reminded of a fundraiser who said to me as a young rabbi, no matter what somebody does to you, Rabbi, always do what's right. And it stuck, not that I always am able to do it. My friend and teacher Danielle Hartman, who is the son of my teacher David Hartman, Danielle now runs the Hartman Institute, maybe the most influential educational organization in Israel for rabbis outside of Israel and lay leaders as well. And Daniel Hartman wrote in his blog day before yesterday that when he was in Lebanon as a tank commander and there was protesting against the Lebanon war, he said he was angry because there he was risking his life for the people of Israel. And there were people protesting, Israelis protesting. And he said, when we're at war, we need to be at war. We can't be unsupported. And now Danielle, who's a peer in age, said, I see it a bit differently. As in Israel now, violence breaks out between Arabs and Jews in cities that were shared by Jews and Arabs. Now is the time, although there is fighting, to acknowledge we can do better. We can do better in honoring the dignity of the Arabs in our midst. It's not easy. There's reason for distrust. But they are fellow citizens, and we have not risen to the challenge of making them fully accepted in our midst with all the dignity, let alone the Palestinians beyond our borders who are under our control. Because unless we use this crisis to make it better, it will only get worse. I don't have answers. Frankly, nobody has had answers to this point. at least that have been implemented to make a difference. What I spoke about last night, and also in the gathering of our federation, is that as we as a people long to return to the state of Israel for 2,000 years, we fulfilled that dream because it was a constant, because we believed it, and because we took action when we could. Our prayers, our story of Numbers is about going toward a promised land that is part of that promise, a land of peace. We need to use our best efforts, regardless of the reasons for distrust, to do what is right. That's the challenge of Leviticus, Liot Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, for ourselves, to rise to our highest human potential of modeling this striving for peace. So that word striving is a word in its etymology that means to wrestle. It sounds like an oxymoron, to strive for peace. And yet our very name is Yisrael. We are the people who strove with God. And so in this moment in which we are all glued to not just Torah, but to the news that's unfolding, we are aware that this is a moment of grave danger. Not only in dealing with Hamas, which is a terrorist government, whose charter is about the destruction of the state and who use terror, who build tunnels underground in order to engage in terrorism, but do not build bomb shelters for their people. An organization that both the U.S. and the EU has labeled a terrorist organization, a terrorist government. But even though that is the case, that is not necessarily true for every Arab and for what is possible going forward. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe. With Parshat Bamidbar, we are in a journey to the promised land, no matter where we are as Jews. Our eyes turn to the promised land when we are in prayer. We pray not only for the dignity of our people in the midst of our ancient homeland. Let us also pray for the dignity of all our neighbors, and yes, even their right of self-determination when done as partners of peace. Peace is only possible when we know it is the goal, and we believe, God, that with your help it is achievable. May we move forward and find a way toward your presence, God. Amen.
Amen. Shekar.